In a world where political leaders, foreign investors, and global institutions often dominate the headlines when it comes to Africa's development, there is a story emerging from Burkina Faso that has turned the narrative completely upside down. It is not about billions of dollars flowing in from international lenders, nor about some powerful corporation unveiling a new mega project. Instead, it is about ordinary citizens, the youth of Burkina Faso, who have taken their destiny into their own hands and done what no one thought possible. With their own limited resources, these young men and women have built roads, yes, real infrastructure, funded not by foreign aid or government allocations, but by their own money, sweat, and vision. The initiative has shocked African leaders and stunned observers across the world, for it represents a radical departure from the dependency model that has defined much of Africa's development for decades. The movement began quietly, almost unnoticed by the mainstream media, in villages and small towns, where frustrations with poor infrastructure had reached breaking point. For years, local communities had pleaded with successive governments to repair the collapsing roads that made transporting food, medicine, and people almost impossible during the rainy season. Trucks would get stuck in the mud, ambulances would take hours to reach hospitals, and farmers would lose crops because they couldn't transport them to markets. But instead of waiting any longer, the youth decided to act. They pooled their money together, organized committees, bought basic construction tools and equipment, and began working with their own hands to pave, level, and construct the roads they so desperately needed. What followed was nothing short of a revolution in mindset. It was not simply about building roads. It was about reclaiming agency, about proving to themselves and to the wider world that Africans are not helpless and dependent on external saviors. When images of the youth laboring in the scorching heat, mixing cement, laying gravel, and compacting dirt with rudimentary machinery started circulating on social media, the story exploded. Within days, the videos were being shared across the continent. People from Nigeria to South Africa, from Kenya to Senegal, watched in amazement as ordinary Burkinabe youth demonstrated a level of self-reliance that had long been dismissed as impossible. What surprised many was not just the scale of what they were accomplishing, but the discipline, coordination, and unity with which they worked. African leaders, often accustomed to promising large-scale projects that are either delayed, underfunded, or abandoned, found themselves both inspired and embarrassed. At regional meetings and summits, references to Burkina Faso's youth initiative became unavoidable. The question was asked bluntly: if young people with little money, limited resources, and no backing from major institutions could build roads, what excuse do entire governments, with access to national budgets, international loans, and vast networks of engineers really have? The symbolic power of this initiative began to rattle the political elite, forcing uncomfortable conversations about corruption, mismanagement, and misplaced priorities. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young leader, could not ignore what was happening either. Known already for his populist stance, his defiance of Western dominance, and his emphasis on self-sufficiency, he quickly seized on the youth-driven road projects as a symbol of national pride and resilience. In speeches, he highlighted their achievements, praising them as an example of what it truly means to take ownership of one's future. But his support was not just rhetorical. Reports indicate that Traoré's government began exploring ways to amplify the initiative, offering logistical assistance, equipment, and even matching funds for communities that were already demonstrating commitment. In doing so, Traoré positioned himself not as a distant ruler dictating development, but as a partner working alongside his people. The global implications of this movement cannot be overstated. For decades, Africa has been painted in narratives of dependency, dependent on loans from the IMF and World Bank, dependent on aid from Europe and America, dependent on foreign companies to extract and process resources. The Burkina Faso Youth Road Project shattered that stereotype with one simple truth: Africans can build, fund, and maintain their own future if they choose to. And this message spread like wildfire, inspiring grassroots movements in other countries. Social media became flooded with calls for a replication. Nigerian youth asked why they couldn't do the same in Lagos slums. Kenyan villagers questioned why they should wait for corrupt officials when they could self-finance their own schools and clinics. The ripple effects were undeniable. Of course, the road-building efforts were not without challenges. These were not billion-dollar highways with gleaming asphalt and towering bridges. They were modest, practical roads designed to serve local needs. The lack of sophisticated machinery meant progress was slow. At times, disputes arose within communities over how funds were collected and managed. There were also concerns about safety, engineering standards, and long-term maintenance. Critics argued that without professional oversight, some of the roads might not last, or could even pose risks. But these criticisms, while valid in certain technical contexts, missed the larger point. The initiative was never about perfection. It was about empowerment. It was about sending a message to the world that development does not have to be outsourced, and that dignity comes not from waiting for aid, but from acting with what you already have. Economists observing the situation began to note an even deeper impact. The youth-led infrastructure building sparked a sense of collective responsibility and investment in local economies. Money that might have been wasted on consumer luxuries was redirected into something tangible and lasting. Communities that once felt fractured by politics or ethnicity began to unite around shared projects. In some villages, even older generations, initially skeptical, joined in the work. Grandfathers who had long lamented the failures of governments now found renewed hope watching their grandchildren take initiative. Women, too, played crucial roles, contributing financially, organizing meals for workers, and ensuring that the entire community benefited from the new infrastructure. As the story gained momentum internationally, the reactions from Western institutions were telling. Analysts and think tanks across Europe and America expressed both admiration and unease. On the one hand, they acknowledged the resilience and creativity of the Burkina Faso youth. On the other, they worried about the precedent it set. If more African communities began rejecting the dependency model, what would become of the leverage that donor nations and institutions had long held over the continent? Foreign contractors, accustomed to winning lucrative infrastructure deals, suddenly faced the uncomfortable reality that they might no longer be seen as indispensable. For the first time in a very real and visible way, Africans were showing that they could bypass the gatekeepers of development. This development also tied into a broader ideological shift happening across Africa. Leaders like Traore, along with counterparts in Mali and Niger, have been calling for greater self-determination, the rejection of exploitative foreign partnerships, and the embrace of Pan-African solidarity. The roads built by Burkina Faso youth became a powerful metaphor for this shift, a literal and figurative pathway to independence. Each kilometer of road constructed represented not just physical connectivity, but also psychological liberation from the shackles of neo-colonialism. The symbolism was so powerful that at one regional summit, when a Burkina Faso delegate presented images of the youth at work, the room reportedly fell silent. Leaders realized that this was not just another development project. It was a grassroots revolution in thought and action. And revolutions, as history teaches us, often begin with small but symbolic acts. For the youth themselves, the sense of accomplishment has been transformative. Many of them grew up hearing stories of poverty, corruption, and hopelessness. They were told repeatedly that their countries were poor, that they needed outsiders to build their roads, schools, and hospitals. Now, with their own hands, they have proven otherwise. The pride they feel is not just about the roads they built, but about the identity they have reclaimed. They have shown that poverty is not merely a lack of money, but also a lack of belief in one's own capacity. By shattering that belief, they have opened a door to a future in which African communities no longer see themselves as victims of circumstance, but as architects of their own destiny. The Burkina Faso Road Initiative is far from over. As more villages join in, as more youth pool their savings, as more communities organize around collective action, the momentum grows. International NGOs have already tried to intervene, offering funds and technical expertise. Some communities have accepted this support, but many have politely declined, wary of losing control of their projects. This refusal has baffled outsiders, but delighted those who see it as a necessary step toward true autonomy. In the months ahead, it remains to be seen how far this movement will spread and what new challenges it will face. Yet one thing is clear: Burkina Faso has lit a torch that others cannot ignore. The youth of the country, through sheer willpower and unity, have forced African leaders, global powers, and ordinary citizens everywhere to reconsider what is possible. They have reminded the world that progress does not always come from the top down, but often from the bottom up. And in doing so, they have delivered a shock to the system far greater than the roads they have built, because they have built something even more enduring: belief.